Have you ever wondered what it would take to command over 80,000 pirates and rule the seas with an iron fist? Well, the answer isn't what you'd expect. Most people think of pirates as raggedy men with eye patches and wooden legs. But the most powerful pirate in history was actually a woman who built an empire so vast that the Chinese government had no choice but to negotiate with her as an equal. In this video, I'm going to reveal the incredible true story of Ching, the pirate queen who controlled the South China Sea and commanded more ships than most national navies. This is a story that Hollywood couldn't make up, filled with political intrigue, naval warfare, and a brilliant woman who outsmarted emperors and admirals. But here's what makes this even more fascinating. After I tell you her unbelievable story, I'm going to take you into the forgotten world of Chinese piracy, where entire families lived their whole lives on floating cities, and pirates operated like corporations with their own laws, currencies, and governments. The year is 1801, and China is in chaos. The Qing dynasty is struggling with corruption, rebellion, and foreign pressure. Trade routes through the Pearl River are incredibly lucrative, but they're also dangerous. Pirates have been operating in these waters for centuries, but they've always been fractured, fighting each other as much as they fight the Imperial Navy. That's about to change forever. Our story begins not with Ching herself, but with her husband, Zheng Yi. Now, Zheng Yi wasn't just any pirate captain. He was born into one of the most powerful pirate families in southern China, a family that had been raiding these waters for generations. But Zheng Yi had a vision that no pirate leader before him had ever imagined. He wanted to unite all the pirate gangs under one massive confederation. Think about how difficult this would be. These weren't just business competitors. These were blood enemies who had been killing each other for decades. Each group had their own territory, their own customs, their own reasons for hating the others. But Zheng Yi was a master politician. Through a combination of strategic marriages, military victories, and pure charisma, he managed to bring together the major pirate factions into what became known as the Confederation of the Coast. By 1805, this confederation controlled over 300 junks and commanded nearly 20,000 pirates. They had their own admirals, their own territory, and their own laws. The imperial government was terrified because suddenly, instead of dealing with dozens of small pirate bands, they were facing what amounted to a floating nation with its own navy. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. In 1807, Zheng Yi suddenly dies. Now, in most pirate organizations, this would mean civil war. The Confederation would fragment back into competing factions, and everything Zheng Yi had built would collapse. The vultures were already circling. Rival captains started making their moves, positioning themselves to grab pieces of the empire. But they hadn't counted on Zheng Yi's widow. Now, we don't know a lot about Ching Shi's early life, and that's actually pretty typical for women in this period. What we do know is that she was likely born around 1775, possibly worked as a courtesan, and was incredibly intelligent. Some sources suggest she was captured by pirates and married Zheng Yi, while others claim she chose to marry him for political reasons. What matters is what happened next. When Zheng Yi died, Ching Shi moved faster than anyone expected. She immediately claimed guardianship over her stepson, Zheng Yi's heir, and positioned herself as regent of the Confederation. But this wasn't just a ceremonial role. She was making it clear that she intended to rule. The other pirate captains probably thought this was temporary. They figured they'd humor the widow for a few weeks while they sorted out the real succession. They had no idea what they were dealing with. Within months, Ching Shi had outmaneuvered every rival claimant. She formed strategic alliances with key captains, eliminated threats through a combination of diplomacy and violence, and most importantly, she proved that she could lead. The Confederation didn't just survive under her leadership, it thrived. By 1809, just 2 years after her husband's death, Ching Shi commanded over 1,800 vessels and between 70 and 80,000 pirates. Let me put that in perspective for you. The entire British Royal Navy at this time had around 600 ships. The United States Navy had maybe 40 vessels. This woman controlled a fleet that dwarfed most national navies. But raw numbers don't tell the whole story. What made Ching Shih truly remarkable was how she organized this massive confederation. She didn't just rule through fear or charisma. She created a sophisticated governmental system that would have impressed political theorists. The confederation was organized into 6 main fleets, each identified by colored flags. The Black Flag Fleet was the largest and most powerful, commanded by Ching Shih's ally and eventual second husband, Zhang Yi. The Red Flag Fleet controlled the Pearl River approaches. The yellow, blue, white, and green flag fleets each had their own territories and specialties. Each fleet operated semi-independently, but they all answered to Ching Shih's central authority. She created a complex system of laws that governed everything from the treatment of captives to the distribution of loot. Pirates who raped captives without permission faced execution. Deserters were hunted down and killed. But pirates who followed the rules were rewarded with shares of the profits and protection from imperial forces. This wasn't just a criminal organization, it was a functioning government. The Confederation issued safe passage documents to merchant ships willing to pay taxes. They maintained diplomatic relations with Portuguese authorities in Macau. They even had their own currency and banking system. The imperial government was completely overwhelmed. Their navy was no match for Ching Shih's forces, and traditional military tactics were useless against an enemy that could disappear into the countless islands and channels of the Pearl River Delta. The pirates controlled all the major waterways, which meant they controlled trade. And trade was the lifeblood of the Chinese economy. By 1810, the situation had become desperate for the imperial government. Ching Shih's forces were essentially blockading Canton, one of China's most important ports. Merchant ships couldn't move without paying tribute to the pirates. The Imperial Navy was afraid to leave port. Local officials were secretly negotiating with pirate captains because they had no other choice. But Ching Shih wasn't content to just collect tribute and raid merchant ships. She had bigger ambitions. She wanted legitimacy. She wanted recognition. She wanted to transform her confederation from a criminal enterprise into something that could negotiate with the imperial government as an equal. This is where her political genius really shines through. Instead of continuing to fight an unwinnable war against the imperial forces, she began sending diplomatic messages to Beijing. She positioned herself not as a rebel or a criminal, but as the leader of a maritime confederation that was willing to discuss terms. The imperial government was caught completely off guard by this approach. They were used to dealing with pirates as criminals who needed to be destroyed. They had no framework for negotiating with what amounted to an independent naval power, but they also couldn't ignore the reality that Ching Shih controlled the seas. What happened next was one of the most remarkable diplomatic achievements in Chinese history. Over the course of several months in 1810 and 1811, Ching Shih negotiated directly with imperial representatives. She wasn't asking for mercy or amnesty. She was demanding recognition and favorable terms for her people. The final agreement was extraordinary. Ching Shih would surrender most of her fleet to the imperial government, but her captains and crews would be incorporated into the imperial navy with their ranks intact. She personally would retain command of over 200 ships and nearly 20,000 followers. The imperial government would pay her confederation salaries and provide official positions for her officers. Think about what this means. The Chinese government essentially hired the pirates and put them in charge of naval security. Ching Shih had transformed her criminal enterprise into a legitimate military force and secured official recognition for herself and her people. But the most remarkable part of the agreement was what Ching Shih personally received. She was granted the title of Imperial Admiral and given control of a significant portion of the imperial fleet. She went from being an outlaw to being one of the most powerful naval commanders in the Chinese Empire. After the agreement was signed, Ching largely disappeared from historical records, which is typical for women of this period. Some sources suggest she returned to Canton and operated a gambling house and brothel. Others claim she remained involved in maritime trade and politics. What we know for certain is that she lived comfortably for the rest of her life and died peacefully, which is more than most pirates could say. But Ching Shi's story is just the beginning of our journey into the forgotten world of Chinese piracy, because what she accomplished was built on centuries of maritime tradition that most people have never heard about. The pirates of the South China Sea weren't just criminals. They were part of a complex social and economic system that shaped Chinese history for over 1,000 years. When we think about pirates, we usually picture the Caribbean buccaneers or the Barbary corsairs. But Chinese pirates were something completely different. They operated on a scale that made other pirate organizations look like small-time criminals. They created floating cities, established trade networks that spanned the entire region, and developed governmental systems that rivaled those of established nations. These weren't desperate outlaws living hand to mouth. Chinese pirate organizations were sophisticated enterprises that provided employment for hundreds of thousands of people. Entire families lived their whole lives on pirate vessels, never setting foot on land except to conduct business. Children were born, raised, educated, and married within the pirate community. They had their own schools, their own religious practices, their own social hierarchies. The scale of Chinese piracy was absolutely staggering. During the height of the pirate confederations in the early 19th century, there were probably more people living as pirates in Chinese waters than there were sailors in all the European navies combined. These floating communities had their own merchants, craftsmen, doctors, and teachers. They were self-sufficient societies that happened to make their living through maritime raiding and extortion. What made these pirate communities even more fascinating was their internal structure. Unlike the anarchic image we have of Western pirates, Chinese pirate organizations were incredibly hierarchical and organized. They had complex ranking systems that determined everything from your share of the loot to where you could sleep on the ship. New recruits started at the bottom and could work their way up through demonstrated loyalty and skill. The captains weren't just military leaders. They were administrators, judges, and diplomats. They settled disputes between crew members, negotiated with merchants and officials, and made strategic decisions that affected thousands of people. Many of them were highly educated and came from respectable families that had fallen on hard times due to war or economic upheaval. But here's what really sets Chinese pirates apart from every other maritime criminal organization in history. They developed their own legal systems. Ching Shi's code wasn't unique. It was actually based on centuries of pirate tradition. These laws covered everything you can imagine: how to divide captured goods, rules for treatment of prisoners, regulations for marriage and divorce within the pirate community, procedures for settling debts, and even environmental protections to ensure fishing grounds weren't over-harvested. Some of these laws were surprisingly progressive. Women in pirate communities often had more rights and freedoms than their counterparts on land. They could own property, engage in business, and even command vessels. Female pirates weren't just Ching Shi. There were dozens of documented cases of women who rose to positions of authority within pirate organizations. The economic impact of Chinese piracy was enormous. By the early 1800s, pirates controlled most of the maritime trade routes in southern China. They weren't just stealing from merchants, they were essentially operating a parallel government that collected taxes, issued permits, and provided security services. Merchants who paid the required tribute could travel safely under pirate protection. Those who refused faced capture or destruction. This created a strange situation where pirates were simultaneously the biggest threat to trade and the most reliable protectors of commerce. The Imperial Navy was corrupt and ineffective, but pirate escorts were professional and dependable. Many merchants preferred dealing with pirates because they were more honest and efficient than government officials. The pirates also served as informal banks and insurance companies. They would advance money to merchants for cargo purchases, provide loans for ship repairs, and even offer insurance policies that guaranteed safe passage. These financial services were often more reliable than anything available through official channels. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Chinese pirate society was how they handled technology and innovation. These communities were constantly adapting new weapons, ship designs, and navigation techniques. They were among the first to adopt Western firearms and sailing technology, often decades before the Imperial Navy caught up. Pirate shipyards were centers of innovation where Chinese and European techniques were combined to create vessels perfectly suited for their needs. They built ships that were faster than imperial warships, but could carry more cargo than merchant vessels. Some pirate junks were floating fortresses armed with dozens of cannons, while others were sleek raiders that could outrun anything the government could send after them. The intelligence networks these pirates maintained were also extraordinary. They had informants in every major port, contacts within government offices, and spies among merchant communities. They knew about imperial naval movements, sometimes before the admirals did. This information advantage was crucial to their survival and success. Living conditions aboard pirate vessels were actually better than you might expect. While space was limited, the ships were organized communities where everyone had a role and a place. Families lived together in small compartments, and children played on decks while their parents worked. Meals were communal affairs where news was shared and decisions were debated. Education was taken seriously in pirate communities. Children learned reading, writing, and mathematics alongside traditional skills like navigation and seamanship. Many pirates were literate, which was unusual for working-class people of this era. They needed these skills to maintain records, write contracts, and communicate with other organizations. Religious life was also important to Chinese pirates. Most vessels had shrines where crews would pray for safe voyages and good fortune. They celebrated traditional festivals and observed ancestral rites. Despite their criminal activities, these communities maintained strong cultural connections to Chinese traditions. The medical care available in pirate communities was often superior to what existed on land. Ship doctors were highly valued and well compensated because keeping the crew healthy was essential for survival. They developed expertise in treating wounds, diseases, and injuries that were common in maritime life. Women played crucial roles beyond just fighting and commanding. They managed finances, organized supplies, negotiated with captives, and maintained the social fabric of the community. Many pirate organizations couldn't have functioned without the administrative and diplomatic skills that women provided. The decline of Chinese piracy didn't happen overnight. After Ching Shi's successful negotiation with the imperial government, many other pirate leaders tried to follow her example. Some succeeded in obtaining amnesty and official positions, while others were hunted down and destroyed. The arrival of European naval power in the region also changed everything. Western warships with superior firepower and technology gradually shifted the balance of power. The British and other European nations had their own imperial ambitions in China, and they weren't willing to tolerate independent pirate confederations that interfered with their plans. But the final blow to traditional Chinese piracy came from modernization itself. Steam-powered vessels, improved communications, and more effective government administration made it increasingly difficult for pirates to operate. The old system of floating communities and maritime independence couldn't survive in a world of telegraphs, steamships, and professional navies. By the middle of the 19th century, the great age of Chinese piracy was coming to an end. Some former pirates became legitimate merchants or joined government service. Others moved to new frontiers in Southeast Asia, where opportunities still existed. A few tried to maintain the old ways, but they were gradually eliminated by more powerful forces. Today, most people have never heard of Ching, or the incredible civilization that Chinese pirates created. Their story has been overshadowed by more famous pirates from other parts of the world, but their achievements were far more impressive than anything accomplished by Blackbeard, Captain Kidd, or any of the Caribbean buccaneers we celebrate in popular culture. These weren't just criminals who happened to operate ships. They were builders of communities, creators of governments, and pioneers of maritime commerce. They developed legal systems, financial institutions, and social structures that influenced Chinese society for generations. Their impact on trade, politics, and culture was profound and lasting. The legacy of Chinese piracy can still be seen today in the maritime traditions of southern China. Many fishing communities trace their origins back to pirate families. Business practices and social customs that developed in pirate communities influenced the development of Hong Kong and other trading centers. Understanding this history changes how we think about piracy, maritime law, and the development of modern China. It shows us that the line between criminal and legitimate was often blurred, and that some of history's most successful organizations operated outside traditional legal frameworks. Ching Shi's story reminds us that power and influence aren't always inherited or granted by established authorities. Sometimes they're seized by individuals with the vision and determination to create something entirely new. She didn't just break the rules, she rewrote them completely, and in doing so, she changed the course of Chinese history. But there's still more to this incredible story that most people never hear about. The day-to-day reality of life in these pirate communities was unlike anything that existed anywhere else in the world. These floating cities had their own unique cultures, their own ways of handling everything, from romance and marriage to crime and punishment. The social dynamics within these pirate confederations were absolutely fascinating and completely different from what we see in Western pirate stories. When a young person joined a pirate crew, they weren't just signing up for a life of crime. They were entering a complex society with its own rules, traditions, and opportunities for advancement. Marriage within pirate communities followed strict protocols that would surprise most people. Couples couldn't just decide to get married on their own. They needed approval from their captain and sometimes from the Confederation leadership. Wedding ceremonies were elaborate affairs that involved the entire crew, and the union created new alliances and obligations that affected the whole organization. Divorce was also possible, but it required formal proceedings where both parties presented their cases to senior members of the crew. Property had to be divided according to specific rules, and custody of children was determined based on what was best for the community as a whole. These weren't savage criminals making arbitrary decisions. They were following legal procedures that had been refined over generations. The role of children in these communities was particularly unique. Kids weren't just passengers or burdens. They were the future of the organization. From a very young age, they were taught the skills they'd need to survive and thrive in pirate society. Boys learned seamanship, combat, and navigation, while girls learned administration, negotiation, and the complex social skills needed to manage relationships between different crews and factions. But here's what's really interesting. Education wasn't segregated by gender the way it was on land. Girls could learn combat skills if they showed aptitude, and boys could study administration and diplomacy. The pirates needed capable people in every role, and they couldn't afford to waste talent based on traditional gender expectations. Punishment for crimes within pirate communities was swift but fair. Minor infractions like gambling disputes or arguments over food were handled by crew leaders. More serious crimes like theft from fellow pirates or cowardice in battle were judged by councils of senior members. The worst offences, betraying the Confederation or harming fellow pirates without cause, were punishable by death or abandonment. What made their justice system remarkable was its consistency. Unlike the arbitrary punishment that was common in imperial China, pirate justice followed established procedures. Accused individuals could present witnesses, argue their case, and even appeal decisions to higher authorities. This wasn't mob rule, it was organized law enforcement. The economic system within these floating communities was incredibly sophisticated. Every member of a crew received shares based on their rank and contribution. New recruits got the smallest portions, while experienced fighters and specialists received larger amounts. Captains and officers took the biggest shares, but they also had the greatest responsibilities and risks. But the pirates didn't just divide up stolen goods, they invested in their future. Successful crews would use their profits to buy better weapons, improve their ships, and recruit new members. They maintained repair facilities, purchased supplies in advance, and even set aside funds for the families of members who were killed or injured. Trade relationships with legitimate merchants were complex and often mutually beneficial. Pirates provided security services, market information, and access to goods that were difficult to obtain through official channels. Merchants gained protection from other criminals and often paid lower total costs than they would have faced dealing with corrupt government officials. These business relationships weren't based on simple extortion. Pirates had to maintain their reputation for reliability and fairness. All merchants would find other ways to transport their goods. The most successful pirate organizations were those that provided genuine value to their clients, not just protection from themselves. The intelligence gathering capabilities of these confederations were absolutely extraordinary. They maintained networks of informants throughout southern China that rivaled anything the imperial government possessed. Tavern keepers, dock workers, government clerks, and merchant sailors all provided information in exchange for payment or protection. This intelligence wasn't just used for planning raids. Pirates tracked weather patterns, monitored political developments, followed trade routes, and even kept tabs on the personal lives of important officials. They knew which magistrates could be bribed, which naval commanders were competent, and which merchants were worth targeting. Communication between different pirate vessels and bases relied on an elaborate system of signals, codes, and messengers. Ships could communicate across vast distances using flags, lights, and smoke signals that conveyed complex information about threats, opportunities, and strategic plans. Trusted messengers carried detailed written instructions between commanders, often using coded language that would be meaningless to outsiders. The medical knowledge within pirate communities was remarkably advanced. Ship doctors had to deal with everything from combat wounds to tropical diseases to the psychological stress of life at sea. They developed treatments and surgical techniques that were often superior to what was available in major cities. These medical practitioners also served as pharmacists, dentists, and sometimes even veterinarians for the animals that lived aboard the ships. They maintained detailed records of treatments and outcomes, constantly improving their methods based on experience and observation. Mental health was also taken seriously within pirate communities. Life at sea was stressful and dangerous, and crews that couldn't maintain morale and cohesion were doomed to failure. Experienced captains knew how to recognize signs of psychological breakdown and had strategies for dealing with everything from homesickness to combat trauma. Entertainment and recreation played crucial roles in maintaining crew morale. Pirates organized gambling games, storytelling competitions, music performances, and athletic contests. These activities weren't just diversions. They were essential for building bonds between crew members and maintaining the social fabric of the community. Religious and spiritual practices varied widely between different crews and regions. Some pirates maintained traditional Chinese religious observances, while others adopted beliefs from the many cultures they encountered in their travels. Most vessels had some form of shrine or sacred space where crew members could pray, meditate, or seek guidance from ancestors or deities. The role of women in these communities extended far beyond what most people imagine. Female pirates weren't just exceptions or curiosities, they were integral parts of the organization. Some commanded their own vessels, others served as administrators or diplomats, and many ran the complex logistics operations that kept the confederations functioning. Women also served as cultural bridges between different groups within the pirate community. They often spoke multiple languages, understood various customs, and could negotiate with people from different backgrounds. This made them invaluable for the diplomatic and commercial activities that were essential to pirate success. The romantic relationships that developed within pirate communities were governed by complex social rules and expectations. Courtship rituals, marriage ceremonies, and family structures all reflected the unique challenges and opportunities of life at sea. Couples had to navigate not just personal compatibility, but also the political and economic implications of their union. Pregnancy and childbirth in pirate communities required special arrangements and care. Pregnant women were often given lighter duties and better food, while experienced midwives ensured safe deliveries. Children born at sea were considered particularly blessed and often received special attention and training. The decline of these remarkable communities wasn't just due to government suppression or foreign intervention. Internal conflicts also played a major role. As the confederations grew larger and more successful, they became harder to manage. Disputes between different factions, competing ambitions among leaders, and disagreements over strategy gradually weakened their unity. Generational changes also contributed to their downfall. The children who grew up in pirate communities during the height of their power lived in a very different world from their parents. Some wanted to maintain traditional ways, while others were attracted to the opportunities offered by the changing modern world. The transition from piracy to legitimate business wasn't always smooth. Former pirates who tried to become merchants or government officials often faced suspicion and discrimination. Some succeeded in reinventing themselves, but others found it impossible to escape their past. The cultural impact of Chinese piracy extended far beyond maritime activities. The songs, stories, and traditions that developed in these communities influenced Chinese literature, theatre, and popular culture for generations. Many of the martial arts techniques and naval strategies that became famous in Chinese culture actually originated in pirate communities. The business practices pioneered by pirate organizations also had lasting influence. Their methods of organizing large groups, managing complex logistics, and maintaining loyalty among diverse populations were studied and adapted by legitimate enterprises. Some of the most successful trading companies in southern China trace their methods back to pirate innovations. The linguistic contributions of pirate communities are still visible today. Specialized maritime vocabulary, coded communication methods, and even everyday expressions that originated in pirate society became part of regional dialects and eventually entered mainstream Chinese language. Archaeological evidence of pirate communities continues to be discovered throughout the South China Sea region. Shipwrecks, coastal settlements, and underwater treasure sites provide glimpses into the daily lives of these remarkable people. These discoveries often contradict popular assumptions about pirate society and reveal the sophistication of their material culture. Modern maritime law still reflects some of the innovations that originated in Chinese pirate communities. Concepts like safe passage agreements, maritime insurance, and international arbitration of disputes all have roots in the practical solutions that pirates developed for managing their complex relationships with merchants and governments. The environmental knowledge that pirates accumulated during centuries of life at sea was extraordinary. They understood weather patterns, ocean currents, seasonal changes, and marine ecosystems better than most professional sailors. This knowledge was passed down through generations and helped them navigate some of the most dangerous waters in the world. Conservation practices within pirate communities were often more advanced than those of land-based societies. They understood that overfishing or damaging coral reefs would threaten their long-term survival, so they developed sustainable practices that maintained the marine resources they depended on. The technological innovations that emerged from pirate communities were remarkable. They modified traditional Chinese junk designs to create vessels that were faster, more maneuverable, and better armed than anything in the Imperial Navy. They also adapted Western firearms and sailing techniques to their specific needs and conditions. Navigation techniques developed by pirates were often superior to official methods. They created detailed charts of dangerous coastal areas, developed new ways of calculating position and direction, and invented tools and techniques that improved safety and accuracy during long voyages. The diplomatic skills that pirate leaders developed were extraordinary. They had to negotiate with imperial officials, foreign merchants, rival captains, and their own crews. These negotiations often involved life and death stakes and required exceptional understanding of psychology, politics, and human nature. The legacy of Chinese piracy reminds us that some of history's most innovative and successful organizations operated outside traditional legal and social frameworks. These communities created solutions to complex problems that established governments couldn't solve, and their achievements deserve recognition alongside more conventional historical accomplishments. Understanding the true story of Chinese pirates changes our perspective on maritime history, Chinese culture, and the development of modern international commerce. It shows us that the boundaries between legitimate and illegitimate activities have always been more fluid than we might expect, and that some of our most important institutions and practices have surprisingly unconventional origins. The transformation of Ching Shih from courtesan to pirate queen to imperial admiral represents one of the most remarkable career trajectories in human history. Her story demonstrates that exceptional individuals can rise above the limitations of their time and circumstances to achieve things that seem impossible. But her success wasn't just about personal ambition or individual brilliance. She succeeded because she understood how to work within and transform existing systems. She didn't just break rules, she created new ones that worked better than what had existed before. The pirate confederation that she led represented a form of government that was more effective, more fair, and more responsive to its citizens than most legitimate states of the time. This wasn't accidental. It was the result of centuries of evolution and refinement within pirate society. The fact that the Chinese imperial government ultimately chose to negotiate with and incorporate the pirate confederation rather than destroy it speaks to the practical value of what these communities had created. They weren't just criminals who needed to be eliminated. They were a functioning society that had something valuable to offer. The peaceful resolution of the pirate wars through negotiation rather than violence was itself a remarkable achievement. It demonstrated that even the most serious conflicts can sometimes be resolved through diplomacy and compromise, when both sides are willing to recognize each other's legitimate interests. The story of how Ching Shih maintained control over such a massive organization reveals just how sophisticated her leadership really was. Remember, we're talking about managing 80,000 people, spread across hundreds of ships operating in dangerous waters. This wasn't like running a modern corporation where you can send emails and hold video conferences. Every decision had to be communicated through a complex network of trusted messengers and subordinate commanders. What made her system work was the brilliant way she balanced centralized authority with local autonomy. Each fleet commander had the freedom to make tactical decisions and handle day-to-day operations, but they all understood that major strategic choices came from her. She created a command structure that was flexible enough to respond quickly to changing conditions, but unified enough to coordinate massive operations across the entire South China Sea. The loyalty she inspired wasn't based on fear alone, though she certainly wasn't afraid to use violence when necessary. Instead, she built her authority on a foundation of competence, fairness, and shared prosperity. Pirates who served her well were rewarded generously. Those who proved themselves capable were promoted to positions of greater responsibility and higher pay. She understood that people will follow a leader who makes their lives better, not just one who threatens to make their lives worse. Her personal relationships within the Confederation were carefully managed political alliances. When she married Zhang Yi, the commander of the Black Flag Fleet, it wasn't just a romantic decision. It was a strategic move that strengthened her position and eliminated a potential rival. The marriage unified the two most powerful factions within the Confederation and made her authority virtually unshakable. But perhaps the most impressive aspect of Ching Shi's leadership was how she handled external relations. She wasn't content to just fight everyone who opposed her. Instead, she built a web of relationships with merchants, local officials, and even foreign powers that made her confederation indispensable to the regional economy. Portuguese authorities in Macau found it easier to deal with her representatives than with corrupt Chinese officials. Merchants discovered that pirate protection was more reliable than Imperial Navy escorts. Even some government officials secretly preferred the stability that her confederation provided to the chaos that would result from its destruction. She also understood the importance of controlling information and public perception. Her confederation maintained what we would now call a propaganda network that spread stories about pirate victories, government failures, and the benefits of cooperation with her organization. These stories helped recruit new members, intimidated enemies, and convinced neutral parties that resistance was futile. The intelligence network she controlled was absolutely crucial to her success. Her spies weren't just gathering military information about Imperial Navy movements. They were tracking political developments in Beijing, monitoring economic conditions in major ports, following the personal lives and financial situations of key officials, and even keeping tabs on foreign diplomatic activities. This information advantage allowed her to stay ahead of government attempts to suppress her organization. She knew about planned naval expeditions before they left port. She understood which officials could be bribed and which ones were genuinely committed to fighting piracy. She could predict economic trends that would affect trade routes and adjust her strategy accordingly. The diplomatic skills she displayed during the final negotiations with the imperial government were extraordinary. She wasn't just asking for mercy or trying to minimize punishment. She was negotiating as the leader of an independent power that had legitimate interests and valuable assets to offer. The terms she ultimately secured were remarkable, not just for their generosity, but for how they recognized the practical reality of what she had built. The imperial government essentially acknowledged that her confederation had become too important to destroy and too powerful to ignore. They chose to co-opt her organization rather than fight a war they might not be able to win. After the agreement was finalized, Ching Shi's personal transformation from pirate queen to respectable citizen was just as remarkable as her rise to power had been. She understood that the age of independent pirate confederations was ending, and she successfully reinvented herself for a new era. The skills that had made her successful as a pirate leader, organization, negotiation, strategic thinking, and the ability to manage complex relationships served her well in legitimate business. The fact that she lived peacefully for decades after her retirement from piracy speaks to both her political acumen and her ability to adapt to changing circumstances. Many former pirates struggled to adjust to civilian life, but she managed the transition successfully because she understood that survival required constant evolution. Her story challenges everything we think we know about gender, power, and social mobility in traditional Chinese society. Here was a woman who rose from humble origins to command more military force than most emperors, negotiated with the imperial government as an equal, and then successfully transitioned to a comfortable civilian life. This wasn't supposed to be possible in early 19th century China, but she made it happen anyway. But Ching Shi's individual achievement, remarkable as it was, represents just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the forgotten world of Chinese piracy. The civilization that produced her was unlike anything that existed anywhere else in the world. and understanding it requires us to completely rethink what we know about maritime history. The origins of Chinese piracy stretch back over 1,000 years, rooted in the unique geography and political conditions of southern China. The Pearl River Delta, with its countless islands, hidden channels and maze-like waterways, was perfect pirate territory. Imperial authorities could never effectively patrol such a complex environment, while local knowledge of currents, tides, and secret passages gave pirates enormous advantages. But geography alone doesn't explain the scale and sophistication of Chinese pirate society. What made it unique was how it evolved from a collection of individual criminals into a parallel civilization with its own institutions, traditions, and ways of life. The earliest Chinese pirates were often fishermen or traders who turned to raiding during times of economic hardship or political instability. Coastal communities that couldn't make a living through legitimate means would sometimes collectively decide to take up piracy as a survival strategy. Entire villages would abandon their homes and take to the seas, bringing their families, their skills, and their social structures with them. Over time, these refugee communities developed into something entirely new. They created floating societies that were completely independent of land-based authority. Children were born and raised on ships, never knowing any life except the maritime world. They developed their own customs, their own values, and their own ways of organizing society that were perfectly adapted to life at sea. The ships themselves were marvels of engineering and social organization. A large pirate junk wasn't just a vessel, it was a floating village that might house 50 or more people, representing multiple generations of the same family. These ships had workshops, schools, temples, and even small gardens where crews grew vegetables and herbs. The social hierarchy aboard these vessels was complex and carefully maintained. The captain and his immediate family occupied the best quarters, while new recruits slept in cramped spaces near the bottom of the ship. But this wasn't a rigid caste system. People could improve their status through demonstrated skill, loyalty, and courage. Marriage aboard pirate vessels created new kinship networks that strengthened the bonds holding these communities together. Wedding ceremonies were major social events that involved the entire crew and often multiple ships. These celebrations weren't just parties, they were political and economic alliances that could affect relationships between different pirate organizations. The role of elderly people in pirate communities was particularly important. Older pirates who could no longer fight effectively often became advisors, teachers, and keepers of traditional knowledge. They trained young people in navigation, weather prediction, and the complex social skills needed to maintain harmony within the cramped confines of a ship. Women in these communities had responsibilities and opportunities that would have been unthinkable in land-based Chinese society. They managed finances, negotiated with captives, served as diplomats, and sometimes commanded their own vessels. The practical demands of pirate life meant that talent and competence mattered more than traditional gender roles. The education system within pirate communities was remarkably comprehensive. Children learned reading and writing alongside practical skills like knot tying and weapon maintenance. They studied navigation, weather patterns, and the complex laws and customs that governed pirate society. Many pirate children received better educations than their counterparts in poor land-based communities. Religious life aboard pirate vessels blended traditional Chinese beliefs with maritime superstitions and practices borrowed from the many cultures pirates encountered in their travels. Ship shrines honored both conventional deities and specialized gods of the sea. Crews performed elaborate rituals before dangerous voyages and held ceremonies to honor fallen comrades. The economic system that developed within pirate society was incredibly sophisticated. Different types of raids and trading activities were organized like businesses, with careful attention to costs, risks, and expected returns. Successful crews reinvested their profits in better equipment, larger ships, and expanded operations. Pirate communities also developed their own financial institutions. Experienced captains would lend money to younger pirates who wanted to start their own crews. Insurance arrangements protected families whose breadwinners were killed or injured. Complex partnerships allowed multiple crews to share the costs and risks of major operations. The legal system that governed these communities was based on centuries of maritime tradition and practical experience. Pirate law covered everything from property rights to family disputes to criminal punishment. Trials were conducted according to established procedures, with witnesses, evidence, and formal appeals processes. What made pirate justice particularly interesting was how it balanced individual rights with community needs. Personal freedom was valued, but not at the expense of group survival. The harsh realities of life at sea meant that some behaviors that might be tolerated on land could be fatal when practiced aboard a ship. The punishment for serious crimes was often severe, but it was also predictable and fair. Pirates knew exactly what consequences they would face for different types of misconduct. This certainty helped maintain order and discipline, even in the most stressful situations. The medical knowledge that accumulated within pirate communities was extraordinary. Ship doctors had to deal with everything from combat wounds to tropical diseases to nutritional deficiencies. They developed treatments and surgical techniques that were often more advanced than what was available in major cities. These medical practitioners also understood the psychological aspects of health and healing. They knew how to maintain morale during long voyages, how to help people cope with the stress of combat, and how to manage the interpersonal conflicts that could tear a crew apart. The technological innovations that emerged from pirate communities were remarkable. Pirates were constantly adapting and improving their equipment to meet the unique challenges of their lifestyle. They modified traditional ship designs, developed new weapons and navigation tools, and created communication systems that allowed coordination across vast distances. Pirate shipbuilders were among the most skilled craftsmen in China. They created vessels that combined the best features of Chinese and foreign designs, resulting in ships that were faster, more maneuverable, and better armed than anything in the Imperial Navy. These innovations often spread to legitimate shipbuilders and influenced the development of Chinese maritime technology. The intelligence networks maintained by pirate communities were absolutely crucial to their survival. Information about weather patterns, naval movements, trade routes, and political developments could mean the difference between success and disaster. Pirates developed sophisticated methods for gathering, analyzing, and sharing intelligence that rivaled anything available to government agencies. Communication between different pirate groups relied on complex systems of signals, codes, and trusted messengers. Ships could coordinate their activities across hundreds of miles of ocean using methods that were both secure and reliable. These communication networks were essential for organizing large-scale operations and maintaining unity within the pirate confederations. The cultural contributions of pirate communities extended far beyond their immediate maritime activities. The songs, stories, and artistic traditions that developed aboard pirate ships influenced Chinese popular culture for generations. Many of the martial arts techniques and combat strategies that became famous in Chinese culture actually originated in pirate communities. The languages spoken within pirate communities were unique blends of different Chinese dialects, mixed with words borrowed from all the cultures they encountered in their travels. These maritime languages served as lingua francas that allowed pirates from different regions and backgrounds to communicate effectively. The festivals and celebrations that marked the pirate calendar were elaborate affairs that strengthened community bonds and maintained cultural traditions. These events weren't just entertainment. They were essential rituals that reinforced the values and beliefs that held these floating societies together. The decline of traditional Chinese piracy wasn't sudden or uniform. Different communities adapted to changing conditions in various ways. Some successfully transitioned to legitimate activities, while others moved to new regions where opportunities still existed. A few tried to maintain the old ways, but were gradually eliminated by more powerful forces. The children who grew up during the final decades of the pirate era faced difficult choices about their futures. Some remained loyal to traditional ways, while others embraced the opportunities offered by modernization and foreign influence. These generational conflicts often split families and communities. The legacy of Chinese pirate society can still be seen today in the maritime traditions of southern China. Fishing communities, boat people, and even some modern shipping companies trace their origins back to pirate families. The organizational methods, business practices, and cultural traditions that developed in pirate communities continue to influence Chinese maritime culture. Archaeological discoveries throughout the South China Sea region continue to reveal new information about pirate society. Shipwrecks, coastal settlements, and treasure sites provide glimpses into the daily lives of these remarkable people. These discoveries often contradict popular assumptions and reveal the true sophistication of pirate civilization. The environmental knowledge that pirates accumulated during centuries of life at sea was extraordinary. They understood ocean currents, weather patterns, marine ecosystems, and seasonal changes better than most professional sailors. This knowledge was passed down through generations and helped them navigate some of the most dangerous waters in the world. Conservation practices within pirate communities were often more advanced than those of land-based societies. Pirates understood that their long-term survival depended on maintaining the marine resources they relied upon. They developed sustainable fishing practices, protected important breeding grounds, and avoided activities that would damage the ecosystems they depended on. The diplomatic relationships that pirate communities maintained with various governments and foreign powers were complex and constantly evolving. Pirates had to balance their need for independence with the practical benefits of cooperation with legitimate authorities. These relationships required sophisticated understanding of politics, economics, and international law. The transformation of former pirates into legitimate business people and government officials was a gradual process that took place over several generations. Some made the transition successfully, while others struggled to adapt to civilian life. The skills that had made people successful as pirates, organization, leadership, risk assessment, and the ability to manage complex relationships, often served them well in legitimate careers. The influence of Chinese pirate society on the development of modern maritime law and international commerce was significant, but largely unrecognized. Many of the practices and institutions that we take for granted in today's shipping industry actually have their roots in innovations that originated in pirate communities. The story of Chinese piracy reminds us that some of history's most important developments took place outside the official channels that usually receive historical attention. These floating communities created solutions to complex problems that established governments couldn't solve, and their achievements deserve recognition alongside more conventional historical accomplishments. Understanding the true scope and sophistication of Chinese pirate society changes our perspective on maritime history, Chinese culture, and the development of modern international relations. It shows us that the boundaries between legitimate and illegitimate activities have always been more fluid than we might expect, and that some of our most important institutions have surprisingly unconventional origins. The personal stories of individual pirates reveal the human dimensions of this remarkable civilization. These weren't just faceless criminals or romantic adventurers. They were real people with families, hopes, fears, and dreams who created meaningful lives for themselves in extraordinary circumstances. The daily routines aboard pirate vessels were carefully structured to maintain order and efficiency in the challenging environment of life at sea. Work schedules, meal times, and rest periods were organized to ensure that essential tasks were completed, while maintaining crew morale and cohesion. The entertainment and recreational activities that helped pirates cope with the stresses of their lifestyle were diverse and sophisticated. Music, storytelling, games, and athletic competitions weren't just diversions. They were essential elements that maintained the social fabric of these floating communities. The food systems that sustained these massive floating populations were marvels of logistics and innovation. Pirate fleets couldn't simply raid coastal towns for supplies whenever they got hungry. They needed reliable, sustainable ways to feed tens of thousands of people who might spend months at sea without touching land. What they created was essentially a floating agricultural and distribution network that operated across thousands of square miles of ocean. Large pirate vessels maintained their own livestock. Chickens, pigs, and sometimes even cattle lived aboard the ships, providing fresh meat, eggs, and milk. These animals weren't just cargo. They were integral members of the crew whose care required specialized knowledge and daily attention. Experienced pirates knew exactly how many chickens could survive in the confined space of a ship's hold, how to keep pigs healthy during rough weather, and how to preserve fresh milk without refrigeration. But the most impressive aspect of pirate food systems was their aquaculture operations. Pirate communities pioneered techniques for farming fish, shellfish, and seaweed using floating pens and nets that could be maintained while the fleet was in motion. These mobile fish farms provided protein-rich food that complemented what could be obtained through traditional fishing and hunting. The preservation methods that pirates developed were far ahead of their time. They created complex systems for smoking, salting, and drying various types of seafood and meat. They fermented vegetables and grains to create foods that would remain edible for months. They even developed early forms of canning, using sealed ceramic containers that could preserve cooked foods for extended periods. Cooking aboard pirate vessels required special skills and equipment. Ship's cooks had to prepare meals for dozens of people using fires that had to be carefully controlled to avoid burning down the entire vessel. They worked with ingredients that were constantly in motion, in kitchens that might be tilted at crazy angles during storms. These culinary artists created dishes that were nutritious, flavorful, and suitable for the unique conditions of life at sea. The sharing of food was governed by complex social protocols that reinforced hierarchy and community bonds. The captain and senior officers received the best portions, but even the lowest-ranking crew members were guaranteed adequate nutrition. Mealtimes were social occasions where news was shared, disputes were resolved, and group solidarity was reinforced. Water management was even more critical than food production. Fresh water is heavy and takes up valuable space, but it's absolutely essential for human survival. Pirates developed ingenious methods for collecting, storing, and purifying water that allowed their fleets to remain at sea for extended periods without resupplying. Rainwater collection systems used sails, tarps, and specially designed containers to capture and store precipitation. Pirates became expert weather watchers who could predict rainfall and position their vessels to maximize water collection. They understood that a sudden downpour wasn't just relief from hot weather. It was a chance to replenish their most precious resource. Desalination techniques allowed pirates to convert seawater into drinking water using solar evaporation and simple distillation equipment. These methods were labor-intensive and produced relatively small amounts of fresh water, but they could mean the difference between life and death during extended voyages. Water storage required careful attention to prevent contamination and spoilage. Pirates used various containers made from different materials, each with its own advantages and disadvantages. They understood which types of storage would keep water fresh longest, how to prevent algae growth, and how to treat water that had begun to spoil. The medical challenges of maintaining health in these floating communities were enormous. Scurvy, dysentery, infected wounds, broken bones, tropical diseases, and psychological disorders all threatened the survival of pirate crews. What's remarkable is how effectively these communities dealt with health problems using limited resources and traditional knowledge. Pirate doctors were often the most educated and respected members of their communities. They combined traditional Chinese medicine with techniques learned from European, Arab, and Southeast Asian practitioners. They understood anatomy, pharmacy, surgery, and psychology well enough to keep large crews healthy in extremely challenging conditions. Herbal medicine played a crucial role in pirate healthcare. Ship doctors maintained gardens of medicinal plants that could be grown in containers aboard vessels. They knew which herbs could treat specific ailments, how to prepare medicines from raw materials, and how to store drugs so they remained effective during long voyages. Surgical procedures aboard pirate ships were performed under conditions that would horrify modern medical professionals. Operations took place on rolling decks, often during battles, using tools that were sterilized with alcohol or heated metal. Yet experienced pirate surgeons achieved success rates that were remarkably high given their circumstances. The psychological aspects of pirate medicine were sophisticated and effective. Ship doctors understood that mental health was just as important as physical health for crew survival. They developed treatments for homesickness, combat trauma, claustrophobia, and the various psychological disorders that could develop during extended periods of confinement and stress. Dentistry was another essential medical skill within pirate communities. Tooth problems could disable a crew member just as effectively as a sword wound, and there were no dental clinics in the middle of the ocean. Pirate dentists learned to extract teeth, treat infections, and even create primitive dental prosthetics using available materials. The role of women as healers within pirate communities was particularly important. Female practitioners often specialized in treating diseases specific to women, assisting with childbirth, and providing the kind of nurturing care that was essential for recovery from serious illness or injury. Their knowledge of herbs, nutrition, and traditional healing practices made them invaluable members of any crew. Childbirth aboard pirate vessels required special preparation and expertise. Pregnant women needed extra nutrition and protection from the dangers of shipboard life. Experienced midwives ensured safe deliveries and provided postnatal care for both mothers and babies. Children born at sea were considered especially blessed and often received names that reflected their maritime origins. The care of elderly and disabled pirates reveals the compassionate side of these supposedly ruthless communities. Older pirates who could no longer fight effectively weren't abandoned or killed. They became teachers, advisors, and keepers of traditional knowledge. Disabled crew members were found new roles that allowed them to contribute to the community's success. The treatment of mental illness within pirate society was remarkably enlightened for its time. Communities that depended on close cooperation for survival couldn't simply ignore or exile members who developed psychological problems. Instead, they developed ways to manage mental illness that allowed affected individuals to remain productive members of the group. Addiction was another problem that pirate communities had to address. Alcohol and opium were readily available in the ports where pirates conducted business, and substance abuse could quickly destroy crew cohesion and effectiveness. Successful pirate organizations developed rules and treatment methods that minimized the impact of addiction on their operations. The seasonal rhythms that governed pirate life were dictated by monsoons, typhoons, and the migration patterns of both fish and merchant vessels. Pirates had to understand these natural cycles and plan their activities accordingly. The ability to predict weather patterns and seasonal changes was essential for survival and success. During typhoon season, pirate fleets would seek shelter in protected harbors and hidden coves where they could ride out the storms. These periods of enforced inactivity weren't wasted. They were times for ship maintenance, crew training, social activities, and strategic planning. The communities that thrived were those that used downtime productively. The spring and fall months, when weather conditions were most favorable, were the peak seasons for major operations. Pirates would plan their most ambitious raids and trading expeditions during these periods, knowing they would have the best chance of success and the lowest risk of weather-related disasters. Winter months brought different challenges and opportunities. While stormy weather made navigation dangerous, it also provided cover for surprise attacks and allowed pirates to move through areas that were normally too well guarded. The most skilled and daring crews could operate year-round by adapting their tactics to seasonal conditions. The festivals and celebrations that mark the pirate calendar weren't just entertainment. They were essential rituals that maintained community cohesion and cultural identity. New Year celebrations, harvest festivals, and religious holidays were observed with elaborate ceremonies that involved entire fleets. These celebrations often included competitions between different crews and individuals. Sailing races, combat demonstrations, cooking contests, and artistic performances allowed pirates to showcase their skills and earn recognition from their peers. These events weren't just fun. They were opportunities for recruitment, alliance building, and the peaceful resolution of disputes. Marriage ceremonies were particularly important social events that could involve hundreds of participants from multiple ships. These weddings weren't just personal celebrations. They were political and economic alliances that strengthened bonds between different groups within the pirate confederation. The festivities could last for days and included elaborate gift exchanges, formal negotiations, and ritual ceremonies. Funeral rites for fallen pirates were solemn occasions that honored the deceased while reinforcing the bonds of loyalty and mutual support that held these communities together. The death of a respected leader or beloved crew member was mourned by entire fleets, and the ceremonies that commemorated their lives were deeply meaningful to all who participated. The artistic traditions that flourished within pirate communities were unique expressions of maritime culture. Pirates created songs that told stories of famous battles, legendary leaders, and the romance of life at sea. These ballads weren't just entertainment. They were historical records that preserved the memory of important events and cultural values. Tattoos served as both decoration and identification within pirate society. Specific designs indicated rank, achievements, and affiliations. A pirate's tattoos told the story of their career and could be read like a resume by those who understood the symbolic language. These markings also served practical purposes, helping to identify bodies and determine appropriate funeral rites. Craftsmanship aboard pirate vessels reached remarkable levels of sophistication. Pirates created jewelry, weapons, tools, and decorative objects using materials salvaged from captured ships or obtained through trade. These artisans weren't just making functional items. They were creating works of art that expressed their cultural identity and personal creativity. The languages spoken within pirate communities evolved into unique dialects that borrowed words and phrases from all the cultures they encountered. These maritime languages served as common tongues that allowed pirates from different regions and backgrounds to communicate effectively. They included specialized vocabulary for nautical terms, weather conditions, and the complex social relationships that governed pirate society. The stories and legends that developed within pirate culture weren't just entertainment. They were moral instruction that taught important lessons about courage, loyalty, leadership, and survival. These tales were passed down through generations and helped maintain cultural continuity even as communities moved and changed. The gambling and gaming traditions that flourished aboard pirate ships weren't just ways to pass time during long voyages. These activities served important social functions, providing mechanisms for settling disputes, redistributing wealth, and maintaining crew morale. The games themselves often required skill and strategy, serving as training for the mental challenges of pirate life. The romantic relationships that developed within pirate communities were governed by complex social rules and expectations. Courtship aboard a crowded ship required discretion and respect for the privacy of others. Marriage partners were often chosen based on practical considerations as well as personal attraction, since couples would be living and working together in extremely close quarters. The education of children within pirate communities was comprehensive and practical. Young people learned not just academic subjects, but also the specialized skills they would need to survive and thrive in maritime life. This education included navigation, seamanship, combat techniques, languages, and the complex social skills needed to maintain harmony within the community. Gender roles within pirate society were more fluid than in land-based Chinese culture. While certain traditions were maintained, the practical demands of life at sea meant that individuals were valued for their abilities, rather than their adherence to conventional social expectations. Women could command respect and authority if they demonstrated competence and leadership. The retirement and pension systems that developed within pirate communities ensured that older members were cared for even after they could no longer contribute actively to operations. These arrangements weren't based on charity, but on the understanding that everyone would eventually need support, and that caring for elders was both a practical necessity and a moral obligation. The diplomatic protocols that governed relationships between different pirate groups were elaborate and carefully maintained. These weren't casual arrangements, but formal agreements that specified rights, responsibilities, and procedures for resolving conflicts. The ability to negotiate and maintain these relationships was essential for any leader who wanted to build a lasting organization. The trade relationships that pirates maintained with legitimate merchants were based on mutual benefit rather than simple extortion. Pirates provided security, market information, and access to goods that were difficult to obtain through official channels. Merchants gained protection and often paid lower total costs than they would have faced dealing with corrupt government officials. The intelligence gathering methods that pirates used were sophisticated and effective. They maintained networks of informants in every major port, used coded communications to share information across vast distances, and developed analytical techniques that allowed them to predict government actions and market trends. This information advantage was crucial to their survival and success. The transportation systems that connected different parts of the Pirate Confederation were marvels of organization and logistics. Messages, goods, and people moved efficiently across hundreds of miles of ocean, using carefully coordinated networks of vessels and trusted intermediaries. These systems were more reliable than most government postal services of the time. The banking and financial services that pirates provided weren't just internal arrangements, they served the broader maritime community. Pirates offered loans, currency exchange, insurance, and investment opportunities that filled gaps in the official financial system. These services were often more honest and efficient than what was available through government-regulated institutions. The legal system that governed pirate society wasn't just a collection of arbitrary rules, it was a sophisticated framework that balanced individual rights with community needs. The procedures for trials, appeals, and punishment were well established and generally respected. This legal framework was essential for maintaining order within large, diverse communities that lived in close quarters under stressful conditions. The environmental conservation practices that pirates developed weren't based on modern ecological theory, but on practical understanding of their dependence on marine resources. They knew that overfishing, pollution, or destruction of breeding grounds would threaten their long-term survival, so they developed sustainable practices that maintained the ecosystems they relied upon. The technological innovations that emerged from pirate communities were driven by practical needs and limited resources. Pirates had to be creative problem solvers who could adapt and improve their equipment using whatever materials were available. These innovations often spread to legitimate industries and influenced the development of maritime technology throughout the region. The cultural exchanges that took place within pirate communities were remarkable examples of early globalization. Pirates encountered people from dozens of different cultures and incorporated useful elements from each into their own practices. This cultural mixing produced unique hybrid traditions that were unlike anything that existed elsewhere. The record-keeping systems that pirates maintained were essential for managing their complex organizations. They needed to track personnel, equipment, finances, and operations across multiple vessels and locations. These records weren't just practical tools. They were historical documents that preserved the memory of important events and decisions. The succession planning that ensured continuity of leadership within pirate organizations was carefully managed to prevent civil wars and organizational collapse. The death or retirement of a leader was a crisis that could destroy everything that had been built, so successful organizations developed procedures for peaceful transitions of power. The loyalty and esprit de corps that held pirate communities together weren't based on fear or coercion, but on shared experiences, mutual dependence, and common purpose. These bonds were forged through hardship and danger and were often stronger than family relationships. The ceremonies and rituals that reinforced these connections were essential for maintaining organizational cohesion. The decline of traditional Chinese piracy wasn't just the result of government suppression or foreign intervention. Internal changes within pirate society also played important roles. As these communities became more prosperous and stable, some members began to prefer the security of legitimate occupations to the excitement and danger of piracy. The transformation of former pirates into respectable citizens was a gradual process that took place over several generations. Some made the transition successfully, using the skills they had learned in pirate society to build successful businesses or careers in government service. Others struggled to adapt to the constraints and expectations of conventional society. The legacy of Chinese pirate society can still be seen today in the maritime traditions, business practices, and cultural values of southern China. The organizational methods, leadership techniques, and problem-solving approaches that were developed in pirate communities continue to influence Chinese culture in ways that most people don't recognize. The archaeological evidence that continues to emerge from shipwrecks and coastal sites throughout the South China Sea provides new insights into the daily lives of these remarkable communities. These discoveries often contradict popular assumptions about pirate society and reveal the true sophistication of their material culture and social organization. The stories of individual pirates and their families remind us that these weren't just faceless criminals or romantic adventurers, but real people who created meaningful lives for themselves under extraordinary circumstances. Their personal struggles, achievements, and relationships were as complex and significant as those of any other historical figures. The influence of Chinese pirate society on the development of modern maritime law, international commerce, and diplomatic practices was significant but largely unrecognized. Many of the institutions and procedures that we take for granted in today's global economy actually have their roots in innovations that originated in pirate communities. The lessons that we can learn from studying Chinese pirate society are relevant to understanding how human communities adapt to challenging environments, organize themselves for mutual survival, and create meaning and purpose in difficult circumstances. These lessons have applications far beyond maritime history and can inform our understanding of leadership, organization, and social change. The preservation of pirate history and culture is important, not just for academic reasons, but because these stories represent human achievements that deserve to be remembered and celebrated. The courage, creativity, and resilience that Chinese pirates displayed in building their remarkable civilization are inspiring examples of what people can accomplish when they work together toward common goals. The continuing fascination with pirate culture in popular media often misses the most interesting and significant aspects of what these communities actually achieved. The real story of Chinese piracy is far more complex, sophisticated, and meaningful than the simplified stereotypes that dominate most fictional portrayals. Understanding the true history of Chinese pirate society changes our perspective on Chinese culture, maritime history, and the development of modern international relations. It shows us that some of the most important innovations and achievements in human history took place outside the official channels that usually receive historical attention. The story of Ching and the civilization she represented reminds us that exceptional individuals can emerge from any background and achieve things that seem impossible. Her success wasn't based on luck or special circumstances, but on intelligence, determination, and the ability to understand and work with complex human systems. The floating world that Chinese pirates created was a unique experiment in human organization that produced remarkable results under extremely challenging conditions. This experiment offers valuable insights into alternative ways of structuring society, managing resources, and creating meaning and purpose in human life. The peaceful resolution of the conflicts between pirates and the imperial government demonstrates that even the most serious disputes can sometimes be resolved through negotiation and compromise when both sides are willing to recognize each other's legitimate interests and practical capabilities. The transformation of a criminal organization into a legitimate institution shows how fluid the boundaries between legal and illegal activities can be, and how institutions that serve useful social functions can evolve and adapt to changing circumstances regardless of their origins. The legacy of Chinese pirate society continues to influence the modern world in ways that most people don't recognize. The business practices, organizational methods, and cultural values that developed in these maritime communities have shaped the development of East Asian commerce and continue to play important roles in the global economy. But perhaps the most important lesson from this remarkable chapter in human history is that ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges can create solutions that surpass anything achieved by conventional institutions. The pirates of the South China Sea weren't superhuman. They were regular people who found ways to thrive in difficult circumstances by working together, thinking creatively, and refusing to accept that their situation was hopeless. Their story reminds us that human potential is far greater than we often imagine, and that some of our greatest achievements come not from following established rules, but from having the courage to create new ones when the old ones no longer serve our needs. The question that haunts historians is what happened to Ching Shih after she negotiated her way out of piracy and into respectability. Here's where her story becomes even more remarkable, because most pirates who tried to retire either ended up dead or back at sea within a few years. But Ching Shih was different. After signing her agreement with the imperial government in 1811, she didn't just fade away into obscurity. She moved to Canton, one of China's most important commercial centers, and immediately began building a new kind of empire. This time, instead of commanding warships, she was running what we would now call a diversified business conglomerate. Her primary operation was a combination gambling house and brothel, but calling it that makes it sound smaller and seedier than it actually was. This was essentially a luxury entertainment complex that catered to wealthy merchants, government officials, and foreign traders. It was the kind of place where important business deals were negotiated, political alliances were formed, and information was bought and sold. But she didn't stop there. Using the connections and capital she had accumulated during her piracy career, Ching Shih invested in legitimate shipping operations, real estate, and various trading ventures. She understood better than anyone how commerce moved through the Pearl River Delta, and she used that knowledge to build a fortune that rivaled what she had accumulated as a pirate. What's really fascinating is how she maintained relationships with her former subordinates who had been incorporated into the Imperial Navy. These weren't just nostalgic friendships. They were ongoing business relationships that gave her inside information about government policies, military movements, and commercial opportunities. She had essentially created her own private intelligence network that operated within the official system. The gambling house she operated wasn't just a place where people came to play cards and dice. It served as an unofficial diplomatic center where Chinese officials could meet with foreign merchants and traders in a relaxed, neutral environment. Portuguese traders from Macau, British merchants from Hong Kong, and Chinese bureaucrats all rubbed shoulders in her establishment, creating opportunities for deals that couldn't have been negotiated through official channels. Her brothel was equally sophisticated, employing women who were educated, multilingual, and skilled in the arts of conversation and entertainment. These weren't desperate victims, but professional courtesans who commanded high prices and enjoyed considerable independence. Many of them came from pirate families and understood the maritime world better than most men in legitimate society. The information that flowed through these establishments was incredibly valuable. Ching Shih knew about trade opportunities before they became public knowledge, understood which government officials were corrupt and which ones were honest, and could predict political changes that would affect business conditions. She used this intelligence to make investment decisions that consistently generated enormous profits. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of her civilian career was how she used her wealth and influence to help other former pirates transition to legitimate occupations. She provided loans to ex-pirates who wanted to start businesses, used her connections to find them employment, and even arranged marriages that helped integrate them into respectable society. This wasn't just charity, it was smart politics. By helping her former followers succeed in civilian life, she maintained their loyalty and created a network of allies throughout the maritime community. These relationships proved invaluable when she needed information, assistance, or protection in her various business ventures. The skills that had made her successful as a pirate leader served her well in the business world. She understood how to manage complex organizations, negotiate favorable deals, and maintain loyalty among diverse groups of people. Her ability to assess risk, adapt to changing circumstances, and outmaneuver competitors made her one of the most successful entrepreneurs in southern China. Her personal life during this period remains somewhat mysterious, which is typical for women of her era. We know she maintained her marriage to Zhang Yi, her former fleet commander, and that they lived comfortably in a large compound in Canton. Some sources suggest they had children together, while others claim she remained childless. What's certain is that she wielded considerable influence within her household and community. The respect she commanded in Canton society was extraordinary for a woman with her background. Government officials, who would normally have looked down on a former pirate, treated her as an equal. Foreign merchants who were accustomed to dealing only with men found themselves negotiating with her directly. She had somehow transcended the social barriers that typically confined women to subordinate roles. Her death around 1844 marked the end of an era, not just for her personally, but for the entire tradition of Chinese piracy. By that time, the world had changed dramatically. Steam-powered vessels were replacing sailing ships. Modern naval technology was making traditional pirate tactics obsolete, and the increasing presence of European powers was transforming the political landscape of southern China. But her influence lived on through the many people whose lives she had touched. Former pirates who had become successful merchants credited her with their prosperity. Government officials who had learned to work with, rather than against, maritime communities continued to use negotiation and compromise rather than pure force. Foreign traders who had dealt with her recognized that Chinese women could be formidable business partners. The transformation of Ching Shih from pirate queen to respected businesswoman represents one of the most successful career changes in history. She didn't just survive the transition from outlaw to citizen, she thrived, building a new kind of power that was arguably more lasting and influential than what she had wielded at sea. Her story challenges every assumption about gender, class, and social mobility in traditional Chinese society. She proved that intelligence, determination, and adaptability could overcome almost any obstacle, and that success wasn't limited to people born into privilege or following conventional paths. But Ching Shih's individual achievement, remarkable as it was, represents just one thread in the complex tapestry of Chinese pirate society. To truly understand what she accomplished, we need to explore the forgotten world that produced her, a civilization that existed parallel to official Chinese society for over 1,000 years. The origins of this maritime culture stretch back to the Tang dynasty, When political upheavals and economic disruptions drove thousands of people to seek their fortunes at sea, these weren't just criminals fleeing justice. They were farmers whose land had been destroyed by war, artisans whose crafts were no longer in demand, soldiers whose armies had been disbanded, and merchants whose trade routes had been disrupted. What started as desperate refugees gradually evolved into something entirely new. Communities that were completely adapted to life on the water. These people didn't just use boats for transportation or fishing. They made the ocean their permanent home, creating floating societies that were unlike anything that existed on land. The family structures within these maritime communities were remarkably stable and sophisticated. Multiple generations would live together aboard large vessels that served as floating homes, workshops, and temples. Grandparents, parents, children, aunts, uncles, and cousins all had specific roles and responsibilities that kept the floating household functioning smoothly. Children born into these communities never knew any life except the maritime world. They learned to walk on swaying decks, swim before they could run properly, and navigate by the stars, while other kids their age were learning to read. Their playmates were dolphins and seabirds. Their playground was the vast expanse of the South China Sea. The education these children received was comprehensive and practical. They studied traditional Chinese subjects like calligraphy, poetry, and mathematics. But they also learned specialized maritime skills that couldn't be taught in any land-based school. They understood weather patterns, ocean currents, marine biology, and the complex social dynamics of shipboard life. Marriage within these floating communities created bonds that extended far beyond individual families. Wedding ceremonies were elaborate affairs that involved entire fleets, with hundreds of vessels gathering to celebrate the union of two people. These weren't just romantic occasions, they were political and economic alliances that could affect the fortunes of entire communities. The bride and groom weren't the only ones making commitments. Their families were essentially merging their resources, knowledge, and networks. A marriage between members of different crews might mean sharing fishing grounds, coordinating trading routes, or providing mutual support during dangerous times. The ceremonies themselves were spectacular displays of maritime culture. Decorated junks would parade through the fleet, their sails painted with auspicious symbols, and their decks crowded with musicians, dancers, and celebrants. Fireworks would light up the night sky, and the festivities could continue for days as different crews took turns hosting parties and competitions. The gifts exchanged during these weddings weren't just personal tokens. They were practical items that would help the new couple establish their own household. Tools, weapons, navigation instruments, rare books, medicinal herbs, and precious materials all changed hands as families invested in the future success of the union. But perhaps the most important exchange was knowledge. Each maritime family had their own closely guarded secrets about navigation techniques, fishing methods, weather prediction, and profitable trading routes. Marriage was one of the few ways this valuable information spread between different groups. The role of women in these floating societies was far more complex and important than in land-based Chinese culture. Women weren't just wives and mothers, they were administrators, negotiators, spiritual leaders, and sometimes military commanders. The practical demands of maritime life meant that everyone had to contribute their skills, regardless of gender. Female navigators were particularly valued because they often had better intuitive understanding of weather patterns and ocean conditions. Women managed the complex logistics of keeping large crews fed, healthy, and supplied during long voyages. They served as diplomats who could negotiate with government officials, foreign merchants, and rival crews. The spiritual life of these maritime communities blended traditional Chinese beliefs with practices that were specifically adapted to life at sea. Ships carried elaborate shrines dedicated to various deities, but the most important were the gods and goddesses who protected sailors from storms, pirates, and other maritime dangers. The The goddess Mazu was particularly revered by these communities. According to legend, she had been a mortal woman who gained supernatural powers and dedicated her existence to protecting sailors. Her temples could be found on vessels throughout the South China Sea, and elaborate ceremonies were held in her honor before dangerous voyages. But these maritime communities didn't just worship established deities. They created their own spiritual traditions that reflected their unique way of life. They honored the spirits of ancestors who had died at sea, performed rituals to ensure favorable winds and currents, and maintained taboos that were designed to prevent accidents and disasters. The festivals that marked the maritime calendar were spectacular celebrations that brought entire fleets together. The Dragon Boat Festival was particularly important, with crews competing in elaborate races that tested their skill, coordination, and courage. These competitions weren't just entertainment, they were training exercises that prepared crews for the teamwork they would need during emergencies. The Mid-Autumn Festival was another major celebration, when families would gather on the decks of their vessels to admire the full moon and share traditional foods. Lantern displays would turn entire fleets into floating cities of light, visible for miles across the dark ocean. These festivals maintained cultural connections to land-based Chinese traditions while adapting them to maritime life. The New Year celebrations were perhaps the most elaborate of all, lasting for weeks as different crews took turns hosting parties and ceremonies. These weren't just social occasions, they were opportunities for communities to renew their bonds, settle disputes, arrange marriages, and plan activities for the coming year. The artistic traditions that flourished within these maritime communities were unique expressions of their oceanic lifestyle. Songs told stories of legendary storms, heroic rescues, and tragic love affairs between people from different crews. These ballads weren't just entertainment, they were historical records that preserved the memory of important events and cultural values. The visual arts that developed aboard these vessels were adapted to the constraints and opportunities of maritime life. Painters worked on sails, hulls, and cabin walls, creating images that celebrated the beauty and danger of life at sea. Sculptors carved decorative elements for ships that served both aesthetic and spiritual purposes. Tattoos played important roles in these communities, serving as both personal decoration and practical identification. Specific designs indicated where someone was born, what skills they possessed, which crews they had served with, and what achievements they had earned. A person's tattoos told the story of their life and could be read like a resume by those who understood the symbolic language. The clothing worn by these maritime people was distinctively different from land-based Chinese fashion. Garments were designed for the practical demands of shipboard life. They needed to be comfortable in hot, humid conditions, quick drying when wet, and suitable for the physical demands of sailing and fishing. But these weren't just utilitarian outfits. They were expressions of cultural identity and personal status. The colors, patterns, and decorative elements used in maritime clothing conveyed information about the wearer's family background, crew affiliation, and social position. Wealthy captains and their families wore elaborate costumes that displayed their prosperity and taste. The languages spoken within these communities evolved into unique dialects that borrowed words and phrases from all the cultures they encountered in their travels. These maritime languages served as common tongues that allowed people from different regions and backgrounds to communicate effectively, creating a sense of shared identity that transcended local loyalties. The economic systems that sustained these floating populations were marvels of innovation and organization. These communities couldn't simply rely on agriculture like land-based societies. They had to create entirely new ways of generating wealth and distributing resources that were adapted to their maritime environment. Fishing was obviously a crucial activity, but these maritime people developed techniques that went far beyond simple hook and line methods. They used complex net systems, fish traps, and aquaculture operations that could support large populations. They understood the migration patterns of different species, the seasonal changes in fish behavior, and the environmental factors that affected marine productivity. But fishing was just one part of a diversified economy that included trading, transportation services, salvage operations, and various forms of maritime craftsmanship. These communities served as intermediaries in the complex web of commerce that connected China with Southeast Asia, creating value through their knowledge of markets, languages, and trading opportunities. The shipbuilding industry that developed within these communities was among the most advanced in the world. Maritime craftsmen understood how to design vessels that were perfectly adapted to their specific needs. Fast enough to outrun enemies, large enough to carry substantial crews and cargo, and seaworthy enough to survive the most dangerous conditions. These shipbuilders didn't just follow traditional designs. They constantly innovated and experimented with new techniques. They incorporated the best elements from Chinese, European, and Southeast Asian shipbuilding traditions, creating hybrid vessels that were superior to anything available through conventional channels. The weapons technology that these communities developed was equally impressive. Maritime warfare required specialized equipment that was different from land-based military gear. Weapons had to function reliably in wet, salty conditions, be suitable for combat on moving platforms, and be effective against both ships and fortifications. The navigation techniques used by these maritime people were far more sophisticated than most people realize. They didn't just rely on compasses and charts. They used complex systems that incorporated astronomical observations, understanding of ocean currents, knowledge of wind patterns, and even analysis of wave formations and bird behavior. The most skilled navigators could determine their position within a few miles, even when they were hundreds of miles from the nearest land. They understood how to read the subtle signs that indicated the presence of islands, reefs, or other hazards long before they became visible. This knowledge was closely guarded and passed down through generations of maritime families. The medical knowledge that accumulated within these communities was extraordinary. Ship doctors had to deal with everything from combat wounds to tropical diseases, to the various health problems that developed during long periods at sea. They developed treatments and surgical techniques that were often more effective than what was available in major cities. These medical practitioners understood the importance of nutrition in maintaining health during extended voyages. They knew which foods prevented scurvy, how to treat dehydration and heat exhaustion, and what remedies worked best for the digestive problems that commonly affected sailors. They also understood the psychological aspects of health and developed techniques for maintaining morale and mental stability. The role of elderly people in these maritime communities was particularly important. Older individuals who could no longer perform physically demanding tasks became the keepers of traditional knowledge, teaching young people the complex skills they would need to survive and prosper in maritime life. Their experience and wisdom were valued resources that contributed to the success of entire communities. The care of children within these floating societies was a community responsibility that extended far beyond immediate family members. Everyone understood that children represented the future of their way of life, and considerable resources were invested in ensuring they received proper education, training, and socialization. Children weren't just passengers or burdens. They were active participants in community life from a very early age. They had specific responsibilities and duties that contributed to the welfare of their crews. This early involvement in adult activities gave them practical experience and helped them develop the skills they would need as they matured. The games and activities that entertained these maritime children were often educational as well as fun. They played games that taught navigation skills, practiced combat techniques through mock battles, and learned about marine life through hands-on interaction with the ocean environment. Their toys were often miniature versions of adult tools and equipment. The coming-of-age ceremonies that marked the transition from childhood to adulthood were elaborate affairs that involved entire crews. These rituals weren't just symbolic, they were practical tests that demonstrated a young person's readiness to take on adult responsibilities. Successful completion of these ceremonies was required before someone could marry, own property, or hold positions of authority. The social hierarchies within these maritime communities were complex but generally fair. Status was based on a combination of factors including family background, personal achievements, demonstrated skills, and contribution to community welfare. Unlike rigid caste systems, there was considerable opportunity for social mobility based on merit and effort. Leadership positions were typically earned through a combination of hereditary privilege and demonstrated competence. The children of captains and other officials had advantages, but they still had to prove themselves worthy of authority. Communities that were led by incompetent leaders rarely survived for long in the dangerous maritime environment. The legal systems that governed these floating societies were sophisticated frameworks that balanced individual rights with community needs. Laws covered everything from property disputes to marriage arrangements to criminal behavior. Enforcement was typically handled by councils of respected community members who understood both traditional precedent and current circumstances. Punishment for crimes was designed to maintain community harmony while deterring future misconduct. Minor offences might result in public humiliation or additional work duties, while serious crimes could lead to expulsion from the community or even death. The severity of punishment often depended on whether the crime threatened the survival or welfare of the entire group. The dispute resolution mechanisms used by these communities were remarkably effective at maintaining peace and cooperation within the confined spaces of ships and fleets. Mediation and negotiation were preferred over confrontation, and considerable effort was made to find solutions that satisfied all parties involved in a conflict. The seasonal rhythms that governed maritime life were dictated by monsoons, typhoons, and the migration patterns of both fish and trading vessels. These communities had to plan their activities around natural cycles that were beyond their control, developing strategies for surviving dangerous periods and maximizing opportunities during favorable seasons. During typhoon season, entire fleets would seek shelter in protected harbors and hidden coves where they could ride out the storms. These periods of enforced inactivity weren't wasted time. They were opportunities for ship maintenance, equipment repair, social activities, and strategic planning. Communities that used these periods productively were more successful than those that simply waited for better weather. The spring and fall months, when weather conditions were most favorable, were the peak seasons for major trading expeditions and other ambitious undertakings. Communities would plan their most important activities during these periods, knowing they would have the best chance of success and the lowest risk of weather-related disasters. The winter months brought different challenges and opportunities. While stormy weather made navigation more dangerous, it also provided cover for activities that required secrecy or stealth. The most skilled maritime people could operate year-round by adapting their tactics and strategies to seasonal conditions. The environmental knowledge that these communities accumulated over centuries of maritime life was extraordinary. They understood ocean currents, weather patterns, marine ecosystems, and seasonal changes better than most professional scientists. This knowledge was essential for survival and was carefully preserved and transmitted through generations. Conservation practices within these maritime communities were often more sophisticated than those of land-based societies. These people understood that their long-term survival depended on maintaining the marine resources they relied upon. They developed sustainable fishing practices, protected important breeding grounds, and avoided activities that would damage the ecosystems they depended on. The relationship between these maritime communities and the natural environment was one of interdependence rather than domination. They saw themselves as part of the marine ecosystem rather than separate from it, and their practices reflected this understanding. This ecological wisdom helped them maintain their way of life for centuries while other societies depleted their resources. The decline of these remarkable floating civilizations wasn't sudden or uniform. Different communities adapted to changing conditions in various ways, with some successfully transitioning to new circumstances, while others gradually disappeared. The factors that contributed to their decline included technological changes, political developments, and environmental shifts that made their traditional way of life increasingly difficult to maintain. The introduction of steam-powered vessels fundamentally changed maritime transportation and commerce. Traditional sailing ships couldn't compete with steamers in terms of speed, reliability, or cargo capacity. This technological shift eliminated many of the advantages that had allowed maritime communities to prosper as intermediaries in regional trade networks. The increasing presence of European colonial powers in the region also transformed the political landscape in ways that were unfavorable to independent maritime communities. European nations had their own imperial ambitions and weren't willing to tolerate autonomous groups that operated outside their control. The superior military technology available to European forces made resistance increasingly futile. The modernization of China itself created new opportunities on land that attracted many people away from maritime life. As the Chinese economy developed and new cities grew along the coast, former maritime people found they could earn better livings in factories, offices, and shops than they could at sea. The younger generation was particularly attracted to these new opportunities. Changes in international law and maritime regulations also made traditional maritime activities more difficult. The old system of informal arrangements and personal relationships was replaced by bureaucratic procedures and official documentation that favored established institutions over independent communities. Many maritime people found it impossible to navigate these new legal requirements. Environmental changes in the South China Sea region also contributed to the decline of traditional maritime communities. Pollution from industrial development degraded marine ecosystems, while overfishing by commercial fleets depleted the resources that had sustained maritime families for generations. Climate change altered weather patterns and ocean conditions in ways that made traditional navigation and fishing methods less reliable. The transformation of former maritime people into land-based citizens was a gradual process that took place over several generations. Some made the transition successfully, using the skills they had learned in maritime communities to build prosperous lives in the modern economy. Others struggled to adapt to the constraints and expectations of conventional society. The cultural legacy of these maritime communities can still be seen today in the traditions, practices, and values of coastal populations throughout southern China and Southeast Asia. Many fishing communities, boat people, and maritime workers trace their ancestry back to the great floating civilizations that once dominated the South China Sea. The business practices and organizational methods that were developed in maritime communities continue to influence Asian commerce in ways that most people don't recognize. The emphasis on personal relationships, flexible arrangements, and mutual benefit that characterize maritime trading has become a hallmark of modern Asian business culture. The linguistic contributions of maritime communities are preserved in the dialects and specialized vocabularies used by coastal populations throughout the region. Words and phrases that originated aboard trading junks and fishing vessels have entered mainstream languages and continue to be used by people who have no knowledge of their maritime origins. The architectural styles that were developed for shipboard living influenced the design of buildings in coastal cities and towns. The emphasis on efficient use of space, flexible arrangements, and adaptation to environmental conditions that characterize ship design can be seen in traditional architecture throughout maritime Asia. The artistic traditions that flourished in maritime communities have had lasting influence on regional culture. Songs, stories, and visual arts that originated aboard ships and in floating communities continue to be performed and appreciated by contemporary audiences, though few people understand their maritime origins. The religious and spiritual practices that were developed by maritime communities have been incorporated into the belief systems of coastal populations throughout the region. Temples dedicated to maritime deities can be found in ports and fishing villages from southern China to Indonesia, maintaining connections to the floating civilizations that once dominated these waters. The scientific and technical knowledge that was accumulated by maritime communities has contributed to modern understanding of oceanography, marine biology, and navigation. Many of the observations and techniques that were developed by traditional maritime people have been validated and incorporated into contemporary scientific practice. The social innovations that were pioneered in maritime communities have influenced the development of modern organizational theory and management practice. The emphasis on merit-based advancement, collaborative decision-making, and adaptation to changing conditions that characterize successful maritime organizations has been studied and emulated by contemporary businesses and institutions. The legal precedents that were established by maritime communities have contributed to the development of international maritime law and commercial arbitration procedures. Many of the principles and practices that govern modern shipping and international trade have their roots in the informal arrangements that were developed by traditional maritime societies. The educational methods that were used in maritime communities to transmit complex knowledge and skills across generations have influenced modern approaches to experiential learning and practical education. The emphasis on hands-on training, mentorship, and real-world application that characterize maritime education has been recognized as effective by contemporary educators. The environmental practices that were developed by maritime communities have provided models for sustainable resource management and ecosystem conservation. The understanding of natural cycles and ecological relationships that was accumulated by traditional maritime people offers valuable insights for contemporary environmental policy and practice. The story of these remarkable floating civilizations reminds us that human creativity and adaptability know no bounds. Faced with challenging circumstances and limited resources, these maritime communities created ways of life that were not only sustainable, but prosperous and culturally rich. Their achievements demonstrate that alternative forms of social organization can be just as successful as conventional approaches, and sometimes more so. The legacy of Chinese maritime civilization continues to influence the modern world in ways that extend far beyond the South China Sea region. The principles and practices that were developed by these floating communities have been adopted and adapted by societies around the globe, contributing to human knowledge and capability in countless ways. Understanding this forgotten chapter of human history changes our perspective on what is possible when people are free to innovate and experiment with new forms of social organization. The maritime communities of the South China Sea created solutions to complex problems that established institutions couldn't solve, and their achievements deserve recognition alongside the more conventional accomplishments that typically receive historical attention. The personal stories of the individuals who lived in these floating worlds remind us that behind every historical phenomenon are real people with hopes, dreams, fears, and ambitions. The sailors, traders, families, and communities who created this remarkable civilization were not so different from ourselves. They were simply people trying to build better lives for themselves and their children under the circumstances they faced. Their success in creating prosperous, stable, and culturally rich communities under challenging conditions offers inspiration and practical lessons for contemporary societies facing their own difficulties. The maritime people of the South China Sea proved that it is possible to thrive even when conventional approaches fail, and their example continues to inspire those who refuse to accept that their circumstances are hopeless. The transformation of Ching from courtesan to pirate queen to respectable businesswoman represents the ultimate expression of the possibilities that existed within this maritime world. Her story demonstrates that in societies that value competence over convention, extraordinary individuals can achieve things that seem impossible under normal circumstances. But perhaps the most important lesson from this forgotten civilization is that human communities are capable of far more creativity, cooperation, and achievement than we often imagine. When people are united by common purposes and shared challenges, They can create institutions and ways of life that surpass anything achieved by more conventional societies. The children who grew up in these floating worlds possessed knowledge and skills that were unlike anything available on land. They could read the ocean like a book, understanding the subtle signs that indicated approaching storms, hidden reefs, or profitable fishing grounds. They spoke multiple languages fluently, having encountered traders and travelers from dozens of different cultures during their maritime childhood. These young people developed a unique perspective on life that was shaped by constant movement, cultural diversity, and the ever-present awareness that survival depended on cooperation and mutual support. They understood that rigid thinking and inflexible behavior were luxuries that maritime communities couldn't afford. Adaptability wasn't just a useful trait, it was essential for survival. The courtship rituals that developed within these floating communities were elaborate affairs that could involve multiple crews and extended negotiations between families. Young people didn't simply choose their own romantic partners. Marriages were strategic alliances that affected the welfare of entire communities. But this doesn't mean that love and personal attraction were ignored. Successful maritime marriages required both practical compatibility and emotional connection. The engagement process often lasted for months or even years as families evaluated the suitability of potential matches. They considered not just the personal qualities of the individuals involved, but also the resources, connections, and reputation of their respective families. A good marriage could provide access to new fishing grounds, trading routes, or technical knowledge that would benefit everyone. The wedding ceremonies themselves were spectacular celebrations that demonstrated the wealth and status of the families involved. Elaborate gifts were exchanged, including rare goods, precious metals, specialized tools, and valuable information about navigation routes or market opportunities. These exchanges weren't just generous gestures, they were investments in the future prosperity of the newly formed alliance. The honeymoon period for newlywed couples often involved extended voyages that allowed them to visit relatives, explore new territories, and establish their own trading relationships. These journeys weren't just romantic adventures, they were practical education in the skills and knowledge the couple would need to establish their own successful household. The birth of children within these maritime communities was celebrated as a blessing that ensured the continuation of their way of life. Pregnancy was carefully managed to protect both mother and child from the unique dangers of shipboard life. Experienced midwives understood how to handle deliveries in the confined spaces and unstable conditions of ocean-going vessels. Children born at sea were considered especially blessed and were often given names that reflected their maritime origins. These ocean-born youngsters were believed to have natural advantages in understanding weather patterns, navigation, and the behavior of marine life. They often became the most skilled sailors and navigators in their communities. The early education of these children combined traditional Chinese learning with specialized maritime knowledge that couldn't be found in any land-based school. They learned to read and write classical Chinese, but they also mastered the practical skills of seamanship, navigation, and maritime commerce that were essential for success in their floating world. By the time these children reached adolescence, they possessed capabilities that would have impressed professional sailors and merchants in any major port. They could handle complex navigation calculations, negotiate in multiple languages, assess weather conditions, and manage the interpersonal dynamics of crowded shipboard communities. The transition from childhood to adulthood within these maritime societies was marked by elaborate ceremonies that tested the young person's readiness to take on adult responsibilities. These weren't just symbolic rituals, they were practical examinations that demonstrated mastery of essential skills and knowledge. Young men might be required to successfully navigate a vessel through dangerous waters, negotiate a profitable trading deal, or demonstrate their courage in combat. Young women might need to show their ability to manage household finances, resolve disputes between crew members, or organize the complex logistics of a major voyage. Successful completion of these coming-of-age ceremonies earned young people the right to participate fully in adult society. They could marry, own property, vote in community decisions, and eventually compete for leadership positions. Failure meant continued supervision and additional training until they could meet community standards. The career paths available to young adults in these maritime communities were diverse and offered genuine opportunities for advancement based on merit and achievement. Skilled navigators, successful traders, capable administrators, and effective leaders could all achieve positions of respect and authority regardless of their family background. The most talented individuals might eventually command their own vessels, establish successful trading enterprises, or serve as diplomatic representatives to government officials and foreign merchants. The maritime world rewarded competence and innovation in ways that land-based Chinese society rarely matched. But success in maritime communities required more than just individual talent. It demanded the ability to work effectively with others in the challenging environment of shipboard life. People who were brilliant but difficult to live with rarely achieved lasting success, while those who combined reasonable competence with good social skills often thrived. The retirement systems that develop within these maritime communities ensured that older members were cared for even after they could no longer contribute actively to dangerous operations. These arrangements weren't based on charity, but on practical understanding that everyone would eventually need support and that maintaining experienced advisors was essential for community survival. Elderly pirates who could no longer fight or navigate still possessed invaluable knowledge about weather patterns, trading routes, diplomatic relationships, and the complex social dynamics that held maritime communities together. They became teachers, counselors, and keepers of traditional wisdom that couldn't be learned from books or formal instruction. The medical care available to aging members of these floating societies was often superior to what existed in land-based communities. Ship doctors understood the specific health challenges faced by people who had spent decades at sea, and they developed treatments for conditions that were rarely seen among landlubbers. The respect accorded to elderly community members reflected the practical value of their accumulated wisdom. Their opinions carried significant weight in important decisions, and their blessing was often sought before major undertakings. This wasn't mere tradition, it was recognition that experience and judgment were crucial assets in the dangerous world of maritime life. The death of respected elders was mourned by entire communities, not just immediate family members. Funeral ceremonies were elaborate affairs that honored the deceased, while ensuring that their knowledge and wisdom were properly transmitted to younger generations. These rituals weren't just emotional expressions, they were practical measures for preserving cultural continuity. The burial practices used by maritime communities were adapted to their oceanic environment. Traditional Chinese customs required burial in ancestral lands, but people who spent their entire lives at sea couldn't always return to their family origins. Instead, they developed water burial ceremonies that honored the deceased while acknowledging their permanent connection to the maritime world. The seasonal migrations that governed maritime life created annual rhythms that connected far-flung communities across vast stretches of ocean. Families and crews that might be separated for months would reunite during favorable weather periods, sharing news, conducting business, and maintaining the social bonds that held their civilization together. These reunion periods were intense social occasions that combined business negotiations, matchmaking, dispute resolution, and cultural celebration. Communities used these gatherings to exchange information about new opportunities, coordinate future activities, and resolve conflicts that had developed during periods of separation. The festival celebrations that marked these seasonal gatherings were spectacular displays of maritime culture and prosperity. Entire fleets would converge in protected harbours, creating temporary floating cities that rivaled major land-based ports in size and activity. These events weren't just parties, they were essential institutions that maintained unity within the scattered maritime world. The competitive events that took place during these gatherings served multiple purposes beyond entertainment. Sailing races tested the speed and handling of different vessel designs, while combat demonstrations allowed warriors to display their skills and maintain their reputations. Trading competitions rewarded the most successful merchants and encouraged innovation in commercial practices. The artistic performances that enriched these celebrations were unique expressions of maritime culture that couldn't be found anywhere else. Songs told stories of legendary voyages and heroic deeds, while dances mimicked the movements of ships in heavy seas. These performances weren't just entertainment, they were cultural education that transmitted important values and traditions. The storytelling traditions that flourished during these gatherings preserved the history and mythology of maritime communities in ways that written records never could. Master storytellers were respected figures who commanded large audiences and wielded considerable influence through their ability to shape how events were remembered and interpreted. The technological exchanges that occurred during these seasonal gatherings accelerated innovation throughout the maritime world. Shipbuilders, navigators, weapons makers, and other specialists shared their latest developments with colleagues from other communities, creating a collaborative environment that promoted rapid advancement. The diplomatic activities that took place during these gatherings were crucial for maintaining peaceful relationships between different maritime communities. Disputes were resolved, alliances were negotiated, and agreements were reached that governed interactions throughout the following year. These weren't informal discussions, they were serious diplomatic conferences that shaped the political landscape of the maritime world. The economic transactions that occurred during these seasonal gatherings created markets that were larger and more sophisticated than anything available in land-based ports. Rare goods from across the region changed hands, new trading relationships were established, and investment opportunities were evaluated and funded. The information exchanges that took place during these gatherings created intelligence networks that spanned the entire South China Sea region. News about political developments, weather patterns, market conditions, and security threats was shared freely among trusted community members, creating collective knowledge that benefited everyone. The marriage negotiations that occurred during these gatherings were complex diplomatic processes that could affect relationships between entire communities. Families used these opportunities to evaluate potential matches, negotiate terms, and arrange unions that would strengthen alliances and create new opportunities for cooperation. The religious ceremonies that marked these seasonal gatherings reflected the unique spiritual beliefs of maritime communities. Traditional Chinese religious observances were combined with maritime-specific rituals that honored sea gods, blessed vessels and crews, and sought protection for the dangerous voyages ahead. The educational activities that took place during these gatherings allowed young people to learn from masters and specialists who might visit their home communities only once per year. These intensive learning periods were crucial for maintaining the high levels of skill and knowledge that maritime life demanded. The recruitment activities that occurred during these gatherings allowed successful communities to attract new members while giving individuals opportunities to find positions that match their skills and ambitions. These weren't casual arrangements. They were formal employment negotiations that could determine someone's future prospects. The retirement ceremonies that marked the end of active careers were important transitions that affected entire communities. Experienced leaders, skilled specialists, and respected elders formally transferred their responsibilities to younger successors, ensuring continuity while allowing older members to enjoy well-earned rest. The legacy planning that took place during these gatherings ensured that the knowledge, resources, and relationships that individuals had accumulated during their careers were properly distributed to benefit future generations. These weren't just personal decisions. They were community investments in long-term prosperity and stability. The transformation of these remarkable floating civilizations didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't uniform across all communities. Some groups successfully adapted to changing conditions and maintained their maritime way of life, well into the modern era. Others gradually transitioned to land-based occupations, while still others simply disappeared as their members scattered to pursue individual opportunities. The children and grandchildren of maritime families faced difficult choices about whether to maintain traditional ways or embrace the opportunities offered by modernization. Some remained loyal to their oceanic heritage, while others eagerly adopted new technologies and lifestyles that promised greater security and prosperity. The cultural memories of these maritime communities have been preserved in various forms throughout the coastal regions of southern China and Southeast Asia. Folk songs, traditional crafts, architectural styles, and social customs all bear traces of their maritime origins, even though most people no longer understand the connections. The business practices that were developed in maritime communities continue to influence Asian commerce in ways that extend far beyond the shipping industry. The emphasis on personal relationships, flexible arrangements, and long-term thinking that characterized maritime trading has become a hallmark of modern Asian business culture. The organizational methods that were pioneered by maritime communities have been studied and adopted by contemporary businesses and institutions around the world. The ability to coordinate complex activities across vast distances using informal networks and personal relationships remains relevant in our interconnected global economy. The environmental wisdom that was accumulated by maritime communities offers valuable lessons for contemporary efforts to manage marine resources sustainably. Their understanding of natural cycles, ecosystem relationships, and conservation practices provides models that are still applicable today. The social innovations that were developed by maritime communities have influenced modern approaches to community organization, conflict resolution, and cooperative management. Their success in creating stable, prosperous societies under challenging conditions demonstrates the potential for alternative forms of social organization. The technological achievements of maritime communities contributed to the development of navigation, shipbuilding, and maritime commerce in ways that are still apparent today. Many of the techniques and innovations that they pioneered have been incorporated into modern maritime technology and practice. The diplomatic traditions that were established by maritime communities have influenced the development of international law and commercial arbitration procedures. Their success in managing relationships between diverse groups with competing interests offers lessons that remain relevant for contemporary international relations. The educational methods that were used by maritime communities to transmit complex knowledge and skills across generations have been recognized as effective by modern educators. Their emphasis on practical learning, mentorship, and real-world application provides models for contemporary educational reform. The artistic and cultural contributions of maritime communities have enriched the heritage of the entire region in ways that continue to be appreciated today. Their songs, stories, visual arts, and performance traditions remain vibrant parts of contemporary cultural expression. The linguistic innovations that emerged from maritime communities have influenced the development of regional languages and communication systems. Their creation of specialized vocabularies and communication methods has contributed to human knowledge about language development and cultural transmission. The legacy of these remarkable floating civilizations reminds us that human creativity and adaptability are virtually limitless when people are free to innovate and experiment with new forms of social organization. The maritime communities of the South China Sea created solutions to complex problems that established institutions couldn't solve, and their achievements deserve recognition alongside more conventional historical accomplishments. The story of Ching and the civilization that produced her challenges are assumptions about what is possible when individuals are given opportunities to develop their full potential regardless of their background or circumstances. Her transformation from humble origins to commanding respect from emperors demonstrates that exceptional leadership can emerge from anywhere when conditions allow it to flourish. The peaceful resolution of the conflicts between pirates and the imperial government shows that even the most serious disputes can sometimes be resolved through negotiation and compromise when both sides recognize each other's legitimate interests and practical capabilities. This example remains relevant for contemporary efforts to resolve conflicts through diplomacy rather than force. The successful integration of former pirates into legitimate society demonstrates that people can change and adapt when given appropriate incentives and support. The skills and knowledge that made individuals successful in one context often prove valuable in very different circumstances, suggesting that human potential is more transferable and adaptable than we often assume. The environmental practices that were developed by maritime communities offer models for sustainable resource management that remain relevant today. Their understanding that long-term prosperity depends on maintaining the natural systems that support human activity provides lessons that contemporary societies desperately need to learn. The social innovations that were pioneered by maritime communities demonstrate that alternative forms of organization can be just as effective as conventional approaches, and sometimes more so. Their success in creating fair, efficient, and responsive institutions offers inspiration for contemporary efforts at social and political reform. But perhaps the most important lesson from this forgotten chapter of human history is that ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges can create solutions that surpass anything achieved by established institutions. The pirates of the South China Sea weren't superhuman. They were regular people who found ways to thrive in difficult circumstances by working together, thinking creatively, and refusing to accept that their situation was hopeless. Their story reminds us that human potential is far greater than we often imagine, and that some of our greatest achievements come not from following established rules, but from having the courage to create new ones when the old ones no longer serve our needs. The floating civilizations they created were testaments to human ingenuity, cooperation, and determination that continue to inspire us today. The transformation of criminal organizations into legitimate institutions shows how fluid the boundaries between legal and illegal activities can be, and how institutions that serve useful social functions can evolve and adapt to changing circumstances regardless of their origins. This understanding remains relevant for contemporary efforts to reform and improve social institutions. The legacy of Chinese maritime civilization continues to influence the modern world in ways that extend far beyond historical curiosity. The principles and practices that were developed by these floating communities have been adopted and adapted by societies around the globe, contributing to human knowledge and capability in countless ways that most people never recognize. Understanding this remarkable chapter of human history changes our perspective on what is possible when people are united by common purposes and shared challenges. The maritime communities of the South China Sea proved that human societies are capable of far more creativity, cooperation, and achievement than we often imagine, and their example continues to inspire those who refuse to accept conventional limitations on human potential. The personal stories of the individuals who lived in these floating worlds remind us that behind every historical phenomenon are real people with hopes, dreams, fears, and ambitions who were simply trying to build better lives for themselves and their families under the circumstances they faced. Their success in creating prosperous, stable, and culturally rich communities under challenging conditions offers both inspiration and practical lessons for our own efforts to create better societies and more fulfilling lives. The forgotten world of Chinese piracy represents one of humanity's most remarkable experiments in alternative social organization, and the fact that it has been largely overlooked by conventional history makes its rediscovery all the more valuable. These floating civilizations achieved things that established governments couldn't accomplish, created innovations that influenced the development of entire regions, and demonstrated possibilities for human organization that remain relevant today. The story of Ching, and the maritime world that produced her is ultimately a story about human potential and the remarkable things that become possible when that potential is allowed to flourish. It reminds us that the boundaries we accept as permanent are often more flexible than we imagine, and that extraordinary achievements are within reach of ordinary people who have the vision and determination to pursue them.